Okay, welcome back. Let's go ahead and talk about the first actual assignment concerning a text written by a great philosopher, and this is the work of Plato, who lived between, we are told, now the date might actually be wrong, but they say 424 to 344 BC. I was reading an attempt at a biography of Plato, which placed the dates a little bit differently, but that's okay. That's the traditional take. What do we know about that? Well, Plato was a Greek. We're in the period of Greek antiquity and the period of the city-states, or what we call polis. I'll get into that in the lecture. This is prior to the Christian era. However, the ancient religion of the Israelites already existed, and by this period, they're already being called the persons of Judea, and therefore, in a sense, Jews, right? Because the 12 tribes of Israel had been reduced effectively to two. 10 were taken into captivity by the Assyrians and probably reduced to slavery or extinguished. And then the two remaining, the actual tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, lived in the territory that ended up being called Judea by the Persians, and then subsequently the Seleucid Greeks, and then subsequently the Romans. Anyway, so the Israelites were in the game at that point. But this is prior to the period of Christ. So we're looking at pre-Christian antiquity in the context of ancient Greece, in the context of the city-state. There are multiple city-states. And the city-state that we're most interested in for the purpose of this discussion is the city-state of Athens, which was located in Attica. So Athens is named after Athena, the patron goddess of that city, and each city-state would worship a particular god of the pantheon of 12 Greek gods as their own particular patron. Plato is the first person historically to write dialogues, and I'm beginning to anticipate the lecture, so what I would like to do now is just move forward. Move forward and backwards at once. We need to approach Plato from an historical point of view and consider what preceded Plato. So let's talk about Greek philosophy. So prior to Socrates, there was a disparate group of philosophers who are summarily grouped together under the telling title of pre-Socratic philosophers. It's telling because Socrates was so darned important, right, that the rest of these fellows who preceded him, and some of them were actually his contemporaries, right? For example, Democritus, and I think Anaxagoras overlapped with him, as did Parmenides. But they were all kind of lumped together and said, oh, these are all just pre-Socratics, because this fellow Socrates was so important, he makes all of them categorically less significant. Okay, so he represented a certain break with the previous tradition, in some important respect, but he carries that tradition on, right? So, in a sense, he represents what they were doing. He's continuing to do what they were doing, but somehow improving it to the point where there's a break. So, some of these figures from the previous tradition included the pre-Socratic philosophers called the Milesians, Thales, who said everything is made of water and all things are full of gods, Anaximander, who said that all things arise out of the indefinite, Anaximenes, who actually precedes Anaximander and maintained, no, I'm wrong, he does succeed Anaximander, who maintains that everything ultimately derives from air. You know, gas becomes liquid, liquid becomes solid, that sort of thing. There's Pythagoras, who we know from the Pythagorean theorem, who maintained that the very essence of thing is number, and mathematicians and physicists and even chemists, they rather like that idea today, that everything is essentially a mathematical character. A gentleman named Xenophanes, who claimed that all is effectively one, but he had a kind of primitive way of putting it. Heraclitus, who argued that everything derives from fire and that there's an internal tension, a kind of unity of opposites, which he calls the logos, in all things. There's Parmenides, who, in the most brilliant way, argues that being itself is one and non-being is inconceivable. There's Anaxagoras, who maintains that mind is that which governs all things. He's sort of one of the first intelligent design philosophers or intelligent design theorists. There's Empedocles, who maintains that the world is actually four elements: air, earth, fire, and water, turning into one another and constituting a kind of natural cycle. And we tend to agree with him, right? Because we can take ice, right, and melt it into water, so the solid becomes water, and the water then can be heated up so it becomes a gas, right? And under certain conditions, something in the gaseous state can solidify, and and so on, right? So Empedocles seems to have gotten something important right. And then there's a gentleman named Zeno, who effectively was a kind of dialectical philosopher who produced a of series of arguments showing that motion doesn't exist. There is no such thing as motion, and people struggle with his arguments to this day. By the way, he's no slouch. And then there's Democritus, who's still alive and well, as it were. He argued that what exists is atoms in the void. Okay, and all these philosophers are worth studying. We're not going to do that in our own course. I might go back to this or that particular philosopher, but and name this or that particular argument. But for now, we're going to allow them just to be and move on. All right. Now, if you want to learn more about them, what I suggest is that you go to this article, the Plato Stanford EDU entries pre-Socratics, and there you'll learn all the basics. So, the pre-Socratic and the Socratic. Philosophy as such emerged in ancient Greece, what gets called Indian philosophy. People sometimes refer to Indian philosophy, sometimes to Chinese philosophy. So what gets called Indian philosophy corresponds to no single word in their ancient languages, and in fact is usually a kind of logically precise theology. Now, the word darshana from Sanskrit means insight and is sometimes used as a classificatory term, but not always. Okay, philosophy has become a universal term. Darshana is an occasional term used in the context of what we call Indian philosophy, and there's seven acknowledged, something 6 acknowledged schools. You can have 3 and end up with 9, depending upon the person you're talking about. Chinese philosophy itself does not employ the term and consists mainly of the ethical, political wisdom of Confucius and the Confucian tradition. It also consists of or includes the quietist nature religion of Lao Tzu. He was one of your first laissez-faire thinkers, incidentally. He was also a bit of a political philosopher. And there were various attempts at synthesizing Confucius and Lao Tzu, and the most famous is 2C. I'm certainly pronouncing all of this, and if you speak any of the 7 versions of Chinese existent fluently, and you're embarrassed at my terrible pronunciation, please do accept my apology. This fellow Chu Xi is effectively sort of the St. Thomas Aquinas of the Chinese tradition. And if you are interested in pursuing this a bit and comparing what we call Western philosophy with Indian and Chinese traditions, there's a scholar named Ben Ami Sharfstein. If you were to type his name into Amazon.com, you'd have a look, or Bookfinder.com, you'd have a look at his books, or Barnes and Noble, any of those would work. For emphasis, neither did philosophy emerge from amongst the Romans. Why am I saying this? In the strictest sense, philosophy did not emerge in ancient India and ancient China. They had their own independent sort of projects, perfectly legitimate for what they were. It's a little bit different for what we do in the West. But philosophy didn't emerge amongst the Romans either, folks. Okay, we look back to Rome as at least one cradle of Western civilization. It didn't emerge in the Americas or in Africa or amongst the Northern Europeans, right? The Norse have nothing to do with it. And the Australian Aboriginals themselves did not discover philosophy. It emerged in Greece and Greece alone. So that motivates us to pose the question, well, why? I mean, it seems like the kind of project that makes some sense. If you read my slides, Maybe my way of describing it is rather rigorous, but I think you can understand why one might think, okay, you find yourself in a situation which prompts a question, you ask the question, and you try to answer it in some kind of disciplined way, right? That's what philosophy comes down to, with certain types of questions concerning the true, the good, and the beautiful. But it emerged only in one place. So let's talk about why that would be the case. I think that in ancient Greece, just try this on for size. I can't uh, give you like a mathematical proof of why it only emerged in ancient Greece, but I think we can make some sense of this. And there are four conditions that we can say obtained in ancient Greece. They obtained together, and they have to obtain together in order for philosophy to emerge. And they did not obtain together any place else. Okay, so that would be my thesis. So first, all human beings experience wonder or amazement at the spectacle of nature. The heavens, the mountains, the ocean, the plains, the winds, the rain, the sun, and the moon. And some of these persons, a subset, decide that studying nature, in response to their wonder, right? They have a kind of reasonable response to their wonder. They say, actually studying nature is more important than anything else. I'm sick of running the shipping company, the small trucking company with my 5 26-foot um, box trucks. I'm working 13 hours a day. I'm only making about, whatever, $82,000 a year when all is said and done with all the incredible amount of hours I put in. I'm done. I'm going to devote myself to the study of nature now. So these people end up being very often maligned as useless stargazers. You can understand. You probably are related to people who are very, very practical. And if you were to tell them, I'm just going to kind of do my own thing, maybe working part-time at Walmart, and with the rest of my time, I'm going to, just kind of write nature poetry or something of that sort. Um, you might lose the respect of some of these people. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so your ancient philosophers sort of like that, and they did write poetry, as a matter of fact. So maybe the example is not too far off the mark. So the second condition, besides wonder, now wonder is universal. Everyone experiences that. Not everyone valorizes it. The ancient Roman Cicero, he said, you should cultivate athamastia. Well, athamastia means a lack of wonder. You're supposed to, from his point of view, you should kill that part of your soul. It's a grim piece of advice, but characteristically Roman. All right. So second, the Greeks, and it also confirms what I said. It is a universal experience because you have to cultivate athamastia, according to Cicero. That means the natural state of human beings is such as to respond with wonder to certain things. Okay, so second, the Greeks in particular widely exercised rule by assembly rule, sort of like a quasi-democracy, but it could be an aristocratic assembly. So you have a small number of persons ruling a territory, let's say 100, and they form an assembly, and then the remaining, whatever, 3,000 or 4,000 have to accept whatever this unelected assembly has to say. But then they vote, and then it's determined by majority, right? That's the democratic element. So each participant in the assembly had to propose his view and then defend it in front of other people. Now that's interesting, right? Because if you do that day in and day out, your wheels start turning. You start thinking about how to do that effectively. You have to learn how to be persuasive. You have to learn how to make your point clearly, how to support your conclusion with evidence and logic, like we talked about. Okay, that means this part of the Greek population, at least, was being given a kind of informal training in logic. You get that? Okay, so the assembly ends up being very important. If you're under the thumb of the Chinese emperor, under the thumb of um, the Persian satrap, right? You are not invited to stand forward and make your policy proposal and then put the thing to a vote. What the emperor or king or satrap or whoever says goes, and that's the end of it. Okay, so that's something quite different. There's a third condition. Now, if you look at the ancient Greek literature, there's a kind of theme which one discovers in multiple texts. It's kind of common to these early, mainly poetical texts. Um, These ancient Greeks, unlike the ancient Israelites, did not trust gods. They mistrusted them, okay? A good example of this is in Hesiod, in his Theogony. There at the beginning, he calls upon the Muses, from which we get the word museum. He calls upon the Muses to help him. But then he quickly warns the reader to proceed with caution. He says, well, don't trust everything I say here, because what I've said was inspired by the Muses, but the Muses lie, right? He doesn't trust them. I mean, he has no one else to go to, right? And he really wants to know. So Theogony means the birth of the gods. He really wants to know about the origin of the gods, the highest matters. One can know anything. The highest matters that there are to know, right? And so he's going to the only source that can help him with this. But he says, well, you can't quite trust everything they say. I sort of have to do this, but I have to take it all with a grain of salt, and so should you. So, but the philosophers hear this, and they say, they certainly had read Hesiod. His poetry had become pervasive, and they were certainly very familiar with the general Greek attitude of not trusting the gods. So, since they have devoted themselves to the study of nature, and they have this informal training in logic, and they don't trust the gods, they draw the lesson. Don't bother with the gods. You can't trust them. You already have the power to figure it out for yourself because you have training in logic, even if informal. Do you follow? So we're going to go it alone. We're going to go it alone, like George W. Bush. Remember that? Okay. Oh, you guys were rather young during that second Iraq conflict, actually. So the fourth condition is this. Greek civilization was oriented towards kleos or kudos. And both of these, we have the word kudos, which is basically a kind of anglicization, a mispronunciation of kudos. You can say kudos, that's how we say it in English. Both terms may be tolerably translated with the word fame. Okay, so people in ancient Greece sought fame. They didn't regard it as superficial. Pardon me. There was a person in the 60s, I think. Her name was Marianne Faithfull, and she was the first person ever to become famous simply for being famous. Like fame became an absolute value with Marianne Faithfull. I thought that Paris Hilton person was like that. I guess she was the heiress of a wealthy family. That sort of made her famous. Maybe you could think of another example of someone who is famous just for being famous. Hasn't appeared in any films, hasn't written a book, can't sing. People bleed from the ears every time the person tries to sing. Yet is just famous. Well, Marianne Faithfull was that. But for the Greeks, fame is something that you want. Okay, why? Because if you become famous, that's not an accident. It's not the product of a publicity blitz or something of that sort. It's not nothing orchestrated. It's not a product of a business strategy. It is something that you merited in virtue of your entering into struggle with others. So these early philosophers, they were competitive. They struggled with one another in order to see who would succeed at stating the truth. Okay? So to put it a little bit uncharitably, these early philosophers were as vain as anybody else, right? So they tended to publish their works and to put their names on what they published so that they could get the credit. All right, so now we have our four conditions, a bunch of people who experience wonder, who have a kind of self-imposed logical training, and who mistrust the gods, and so they want to study the object of wonder independently by using their own power of reason, and then they start competing with one another to see who does it best. Boom, philosophy. So here's our transition to Socrates. Now, these early Greek philosophers were interested, as we have said, in nature. They weren't really interested in the question of the good life or the question of the good society, not in morality or politics, right? But here's where things become interesting. They also claimed, in effect, to live a blessed life. Okay, now that does become interesting, right? They're effectively claiming that their life is better than than the political life, guys. And your ancient Greek held that the political life was the life. Because if you are able to engage in politics, that means you're free. And the alternative to this is to be unspeakably debased position of being a slave. Okay? So the philosopher comes forward and says, well, yeah, I don't want to be a slave either, but there's something even better than what you have chosen. And in a way, he's kind of insinuating that what you people do in the polis, you people are really a mere means for me, which is kind of condescending, right? So he, in effect, maybe he doesn't say it, too loudly in order not to get assaulted, right? But he in effect says, the world exists for my sake, right? Because I'm leading the best possible life. You political guys, you can do what you like. That's fine. But really, the life I'm leading is the best one. So this is a value claim. All right. Here's the difficulty. They had no argument to justify their conclusion. You get that? They said, my life is the best, and I'm a man of reason. I say, okay, fine. If you're a man of reason, and your life is supposedly the best, prove it. Well, he had no proof because all these early philosophers were almost all of them were just what we would call natural scientists. They were like chemists, right? With ice being melted into water and water being turned into gas. They basically were chemists, and a chemist could not provide you with a chemical calculation proving that his chemical life, the life of a chemist, is the best life. He couldn't even prove to you that it's good. This is an interesting observation, guys. We're always told that science is important and wonderful. We should applaud it. And it is important. It has its problems, but it's important. But you can't find anything in any science that can prove that science is good. Okay? If science is good, it's good because of something that science doesn't study. So science doesn't study everything. That's the end of that. So this is where Socrates entered. He was the first philosopher to inquire into the human good. Okay? So this subject, I've already indicated, can be divided into two parts. The good life, the good life for a person, and the good society. Society composed, obviously, of multiple persons, normally in the context of families that exist side by side in some kind of social cooperation. So now we want to look at Plato. Now, Plato was Socrates' disciple. He followed Socrates around, the actual flesh and blood Socrates, not the guy in the dialogue. Socrates was put to death in 399 BC, and this was significantly this was made possible by Athens having been defeated by the Spartans having imposed what later got called the 30 tyrants, or the 30 autocrats over Athens. There was a rebellion. The 30 tyrants were removed from power. The democracy was reestablished. Okay. This was all right after the end of the Peloponnesian War. Okay. Which actually consists of two chunks with a big period of peace right in the middle. But the Peloponnesian War is dated from 431 BC to 404 BC. Okay. But there was really two wars. With a certain continuity. And then after all is said and done, Athens attempts a restoration, and Socrates had the reputation of being a kind of anti-democratic thinker, and so some individuals grabbed the opportunity and had him killed. Now, what Plato does, he sees something deeper in this. He sees a latent hostility towards philosophy and a natural antagonism. Okay, a natural antagonism between philosophy and political society. The two can't really coexist in peace. If there's a peace between them, it's a best an uneasy peace and has to be managed and negotiated, particularly by the philosopher, because the philosopher is in the minority position, and he's the one who is in continuous danger of being overpowered by the many, who can arrest him and have him killed. All right. So what Plato does in response to Socrates, he imitates him in a couple of ways. Okay, he first of all, Socrates didn't charge anybody. The actual flesh and blood, real Socrates, he didn't charge anybody to interact with him. This is what we get from all the sources, from Plato, a source named Xenophon, and for all intents and purposes, Aristophanes. So we know that Now, at least we have a sufficient ground for believing that Socrates charged nothing. So Plato didn't charge anything either. Socrates also published nothing. Okay, now there Plato distinguishes himself from Socrates, but he follows him in another respect. Socrates never actually claimed to know anything definite. I mean, that's the tradition we get, and Plato does the same thing. He he chooses to write what we call dialogues, which is basically a philosophical drama. It has characters, it has a plot. The plot means a beginning, middle, and an end, right? And it has a peculiar sort of diction. And diction means linguistic style. And in these dialogues, Plato never appears as a character. Now, Cicero, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote dialogues too. He appears as a character in his dialogues. So you know what Cicero actually believed. He tells you by making himself a character in his dialogues. Aristotle, the disciple of Plato and a kind of critic of Plato too, he likewise wrote dialogues, and he appeared. He has a character named Aristotle in his dialogues. So you know what he believed. Plato does not say a darn thing in any of his dialogues, and that way he continues to imitate Socrates. He imitates Socrates, if you like, a third way by creating a representation of Socrates that he puts in the dialogue. You follow me? And with that, you know, he makes Socrates also the hero of his dialogues. He's not the hero in every single one, but the majority. And so what that tells us is that Plato, he wants us to identify him with the historical Socrates. He wants us to understand that he is carrying on Socrates' mission. And what was Socrates' mission? Well, it was to, as the words of Cicero, to take philosophy down from the heavens into the dwelling places of men. You get it? That means to take the process of disciplined inquiry into whatever you're investigating and bring that into the dwelling places of men, particularly into the marketplace where people mill about and talk to one another, with a view towards basically changing how they think and improving it and directing them towards truth. And if you can't get there immediately, directing them towards the pursuit of truth, so that we then construct a philosophical society. Because ancient Athens, particularly, was a society at the time of Plato, a society likewise in something of a state of crisis, like our own is. And there was at the time a general reliance upon what we today call appeals to emotion in order to win the day in debate. And the philosophers don't like that. They want things to be demonstrated from first principles, step by step, to conclusions which follow with deductive necessity from the first principles themselves, indubitably known to be true with certainty. So Plato, in a way, represents that tradition. In another way, he qualifies it because he himself never puts forward any definite doctrines. He raises questions. He constructs extraordinary theories, puts them in the mouths of fictitious personages in his dialogues. For example, Timaeus, this character Timaeus probably never existed. Even the Socrates in the dialogues is clearly an invention of Plato. It's not an accurate representation of the historical Socrates, and so on. So Plato he's doing a bit of both. You know, he's putting forward that philosophical method. I give you my description of that in the slides you went through and the presentation I made of them. And he's also saying, well, you know, this is a very difficult endeavor, and yes, we have to do this. We have to do this, however difficult it is. But let's not fool ourselves and think we're going to get to the conclusion easily. The best I can do as Plato is lay out the fundamental questions, give you some ways of thinking about an answer to each of these questions. And then once I've done that, my job is done. And it turns out that doing that itself is a kind of world historical task. And then if you read through the Platonic corpus, I can't give you any warmer recommendation or I'll leave it unqualified. I can't give you any warmer recommendation than to read through the Platonic corpus, and to read it regularly. Yeah, it'll make you into a better human being. Now that I've said that, there are certain things you should make a kind of lifelong companion. Plato would be the one. The Bible, after studying it very carefully for years, I've concluded that the Bible contains a deeper insight into human nature than any other book or collection of books that one's going to encounter. But as it turns out, what's said in Plato, what's said in the Bible is basically consistent. They're consistent with one another, only the Bible goes deeper. And then the works of Shakespeare, okay? Um, and if you just worked with those three, you're going to be okay. Now, I said that you can add um, Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, all right? Dante's Divine Comedy, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And it'll be quite an effort just to work on everything I mentioned. And I didn't even mention Aristotle. Okay, the philosophy of Aristotle. Okay, well, you have a lifetime of reading right there, because all that material is infinitely rich, basically inexhaustible. You can just read through that in a big cycle over a period of 50 years, then die a happy death, and you'll become much wiser. So I'll leave it at that. I don't think any one of you is going to take me up on that particular description of how to lead your life. I can approximate to it because it's part of my job, but even I have to read, other stuff, and it's not a bad thing. So here we go. So let's leave it at that. At the bottom, I suggest is a tension, right? One ought to intervene. What Plato is saying is that one ought to intervene philosophically in the common affairs of human beings, right? But one should expect some resistance and even outright hostility. The Laches represents this because there's Socrates intervening, and then there's a little, there's something approximating to a fist fight. It's not, they don't actually come to blows, but there's some real hostile feelings communicated between a couple of the interlocutors towards the end. So we can't assume naively that everybody's going to respond positively to philosophy, but we have to bring it to the people anyway, right? That seems to be something of the thought that Plato is trying to get across. Let's talk about the Laches itself. This is, again, a dialogue. It belongs to a small class of short Platonic dialogues, which include the Charmides, the Cleitophon, the Ion, and yet others. Many Platonic dialogues analyze a specific virtue or the concept of virtue in general. Now, the Greek term for virtue is arete. For some reason, I didn't put it on the slide, but never to fear. It's on a subsequent slide, okay? So you can write it down when it appears. The Laches analyzes the specific virtue of courage, or you can say valor or bravery, and the Greek term is andreia, right? So Andrea, that's the woman's name, and Andre, the man's name, means courageous. So the action opens with Lysimachus. His name means something like free from battle or loosed from battle, one of the two. He asks his companions, Nicias and Laches, for their opinion concerning the utility of lessons in a peculiar sort of swordsmanship in armor. And the chief question is whether training in this particular martial skill would be a good choice for their sons. Okay, so have you ever heard parents debating which martial arts school to send their children to? I have. Okay, I was taking my kids to Way of the Dragon over in East Providence, and I was friendly with a married couple there. And the mother came out and said, well, how'd this get unplugged? Someone showed up in my room and unplugged it. Back. Are you in a struggle with a member of your family is always unplugging stuff, you're plugging it back in? Well, that's what I'm experiencing here. And she said, I'm taking him out of this place and I'm putting him in a different place. It's a better martial art, costs less money. Okay, so fine. This is the kind of thing people talk about. So we can relate to this. So I suggest the following question. Note how tentative Lysimachus is in asking for advice. What is the cause of this hesitancy, if I'm correct in noticing this? On the one hand, he might not want to appear like a know-nothing in an area of supreme importance, the education of the youth. It's just like us, No Child Left Behind sort of thing with Bush. And We have to look after our kids. We need more money for education and so on, right? All societies are concerned with all societies worth their salt are concerned with the education of the youth. So if the youth of a political community are well educated, well prepared, well trained, then the political community will enjoy greater probability of enduring and flourishing in the future. So you can see in an ancient society like this, when they devote so much care to the youth, it's not simply because they expect to get a payback, it's because they regard their way of life as good. I mean, isn't it true here too? I mean, we think that we have American traditions, we do, and we want to pass those on, and we want to do that despite the fact that we know that we're going to die at some point, and so that those good things that we enjoy here continue to be enjoyed by other people, and in a way that they just continue to exist. That there's something good, right, about these traditions, and it would be really a kind of catastrophe if they were simply eliminated from human experience. No, I mean, what if big tidal wave came along and wiped away our country, and one thing led to another in 1,000 years? People didn't even know who Thomas Jefferson was, or Abraham Lincoln, or to be more contemporary, or closer to more contemporary, Martin Luther King, or any of these people. How many of you just shrug and say, "Oh, who cares anyway? These people are boring. They're not worth knowing." Well, I mean, only a very extreme person, or maybe someone who's bitter and hates the country or something of that sort, would say something like that. But even in that case, those persons think that these persons are persons I just named are important enough that they ought to, in a way, kind of be indirectly punished by being wiped off the face of history. Um, I don't think there's anybody. Well, it must be somebody, but I'd be hard pressed to find someone who regards this question of the perdurance of tradition as a matter of total indifference. Anyway, so pardon for that digression. So another issue is that if you don't look after your youth, your society is going to corrupt, right? It becomes worse. All right, let's leave it at that. So, continuing the analysis, war and education. Note further that the opening scene just juxtaposes and connects two themes, fighting on the one hand and education on the other. Okay? I mean, we're talking about a war-like society in a war mode. Okay, this is probably situated around the time, or maybe slightly before the beginning of the Peloponnesian War in 431. But before it began, people could sense what was coming. You know, um, they knew that there was trouble coming down the pike with Sparta. So the citizens of a state fight in order to preserve in the present the state's territory, their people and possessions, or else both to take the land and possessions of another state and to enslave its people. Okay, so and there's one or two reasons to fight: to keep what you have, or to keep what you have and to take what other people have. Even them, to take them themselves, reduce them to slavery. I mean, we don't do that today, not in an open way, though there are millions of slaves in this world today, by the way. But you see the point of war. What's education by contrast? Education is necessary to preserve the state in the future by forming people in accordance with a certain model of education. And the Greeks would think in accordance with a certain ethical model too. For them, education would not exclude, on the contrary, it would definitely include a formation in the virtues that make a human being perfect, okay, or at least approximate to a kind of finish and perfection, in the way that you take a piece of marble and you chisel it into a finished form. They thought about forming people in accordance with a complete model. Sometimes you find a Catholic college, for example, the PC, and they say, well, we're not interested simply in training your mind. We want to produce a complete person. And so obviously at PC, they emphasize athletics, and they're a Catholic college, so they emphasize spiritual development, spiritual, bodily, and intellectual all at once, right? So the Greeks were kind of like that. They wanted to form the whole person top to bottom. I don't know what you did in your high school, but maybe it had that kind of philosophy, maybe it didn't. So in a definite sense, what is being discussed, whether we're talking about education or training in a specific kind of fighting, the whole discussion is political through and through. You have to appreciate that to understand the atmosphere within which the action of the dialogue unfolds. These are all political-minded persons. Okay, and this is really a kind of political discussion. So, the reluctance to advise. Lysimachus explicitly refers to another reason for their hesitancy in asking for advice, and this is that many persons are reluctant to give it and simply say what they guess those seeking the advice want to hear. I mean, they'll simply say, okay, what's this guy believe already? I'll just tell him what he believes. Do you find yourself in that position? Sometimes you get sick of, you get so sick of potentially offending anyone or getting to some kind of sticky situation, you just tell them what they want to hear and you move on, right? And you'll understand that. Why do people act this way? Well, I already said that. Let's see here. So most people will not share what they think they know to be good so as to preserve a state of psychological comfort uninterrupted. That's true too. I remember during the COVID thing, a goodly number of persons confided in me that they thought the whole thing was just complete nonsense. That the science, they were cooking the numbers and the recommendations they gave were completely arbitrary and even calculated to harm us. But they wouldn't say that at work, right? And they tended to keep quiet, and they weren't going to make a point. They weren't going to take the position of an activist, right? A small number of people did that. They're online, and they're still kind of shouting, really, about what happened then. They claim it's not over. They claim that the person's getting affected by that that potion people got injected with. They say that's causing a lot of harm. You guys tell me. But most people don't want to don't want to sacrifice their state of psychological comfort. Is that a fair way of putting it? You know, they want to avoid confrontation, controversy, and they definitely don't want to lose their job and stuff like that. So here we go. But Lysimachus states two things. First, that Nicias and Laches are the kind of men who do speak their minds. Second, that they are good judges. Okay, so he's kind of buttering them up here, isn't he? So Laches and Nicias, we should observe, belong to, according to Lysimachus, they belong to a distinct subset of human beings, those who are willing to express their judgments on which course of action is wise and which course of action is unwise. Okay, that sort of person. This is the kind of person who will just found a YouTube channel and just start mouthing off, more or less, right? Not everyone does that. It's a subset of our species. Laches then offered his first piece of advice sought for, but certainly, his first piece of sought for, but certainly unexpected advice. He said, well, actually what we should do, if I may defer for a moment, is consult Socrates, as he is known for his concern for the youth. And he's also known for the time he spends with them. Back then, that was considered to be a good thing. Today, if we have a middle-aged man chasing around the youth, and he's not a paid educator, we call the police, right? But not then, okay? And they regarded Socrates as a friend of the youth and someone concerned with their education. So note then that Socrates here was presented as a kind of self-appointed informal mentor of the youth of Athens. Okay, so this is a wise choice, choosing Socrates, if his aim was to form the subsequent generation in the habits of rational thought, philosophical dialogue, and love of truth. So is it possible that Laches is a kind of secret agent supporting philosophy here? It's an interesting thought. It's be difficult to justify that fully given what happens by the end of the dialogue, and you're familiar with that now. So let's look at Nicias's first speech. Socrates, in turn, defers to his elders. He throws the ball back to Nicias and Laches. And Nicias speaks first. He offers the following reasons in favor of hiring the master of sword fighting in armor. First, training in this art tends to improve bodily health. Okay, very good. But doesn't all sorts of training do that? Second, gymnastics and horse riding are the arts of a free man, and no form of gymnastic could be better or harder exercise. And then the first thing that occurs to me, aren't there sorts that are equally difficult, okay, and equally good? Third, those trained in arms are alone, as he says, athletes of the military profession. I'll just let that stand. I'm not even certain quite what he means by that. Fourth, it is of some use fighting with a weapon, sword fighting in armor. It is of some use when fighting in the line, and of more use when the line is broken and one pursues the enemy or is pursued by him. Okay, so I've neglected to say something very important. I mean, these Greeks, they fought rather in hoplite formation, and the idea there was that you would form a line and then several lines deep, 5 to 10, whatever it would be, and each of you would have a gigantic shield and a spear. Forget about the sword. And the whole key to success in hoplite warfare was to keep one's place in the line, and then to move in unison with one's phalanx, like this mass of human beings and shields and spears, move more quickly than the opposing phalanx and get around to the side so you get to their exposed parts and then massacre them with your spears. So if that's how you fight, then sword play has no place here whatsoever. Okay. But Nicias continues. He who possesses the art will meet no harm in one-on-one combat, or perhaps even combat with several. So it's as if Nicias is expecting the line to break and for each individual to have to fight on his own. All right. Sixth, once this art is mastered, the student will want to learn how to arrange an army, and then the whole of military science. Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, do we want everyone to go ahead and become a general? Well, no, he'll say, no, this will only be something that some people could afford, and then that person will go on and become a general. Well, okay, well, let that stand. Seventh, it will make a man more valiant and self-possessed in the field. Okay, maybe. I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I don't see how it's relevant for hoplite warfare. And eighth, he will put forward a more formidable appearance and thus strike terror to his opponent. And once again, I have to say, I don't see how that's the case given how the Greeks fought. So, Laches, he begins by offering a common sense argument that he will subsequently undermine. So here's his first common sense argument. It's kind of hard to argue with this or argue against it. All knowledge is worth learning. True. Sword fighting in armor is a kind of knowledge. Okay. Therefore, sword fighting in armor is worth learning. Okay, in some general abstract way. But as economists say, every choice has a cost. And if you choose to study sword fighting in armor, well, it's going to take months or not years to master that. And that means there's something else to which you haven't devoted your time, right? So Laches accordingly draws a distinction between valuable and non-valuable knowledge. Well, when he says there's non-valuable knowledge, he's undermining his original statement. He said all knowledge is worth learning. Well, not if it lacks value, right? Okay, so the very existence of this category undermines the first premise, and so that defeats the argument. Note that Laches, right? Remember, all your premises have to be true in order for the argument to be good. Premise 1 is false. Note that Laches actually argues in an explicit fashion, while Nicias simply laid out a series of positive considerations, each of which implicitly suggests a modus ponens argument. By the way, when you don't lay out the entire argument, when it's merely suggested, what you have is what we call an enthymeme. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. You can look that up. So Laches' next argument goes like this. If this art were really valuable, the Lacedaemonians would have discovered it. They have not discovered it. Therefore, it is not valuable. Okay. A kind of argument based upon the wisdom of the Lacedaemonians. Lacedaemonians, excuse me, really spacing out here. Back where we need to be. Another argument. If this art were really valuable, then those who teach it would not avoid Lacedaemonia, but they do studiously avoid it. Therefore, this art is not really valuable. Okay, very good. Another argument based upon the wisdom of the Lacedaemonians in all matters military. Another, if all persons practicing this art are undistinguished, then the art is worthless. As a matter of fact, all persons practicing this art have been undistinguished, and that's not surprising given the way the Greeks fought. Therefore, the art is worthless. Okay. You can almost see Laches appearing on Fox News, right? Laying out his very kind of gruff, common sense refutation of the worth of this particular course of study. Let's see. So Laches finally says that the possessions of such an art would make a coward rash, but it would make a courageous man look ridiculous. So now he's finally waving at the real issue, the relation between this art and courage, and that's where Socrates is going to bring it pretty soon. So Nicias is for studying the art, Laches is against studying it. The Symmachus appeals to Socrates as the kind of tie-breaking vote, as it were. So there's a kind of mock democratic procedure here. The majority will win. So Socrates says, here's a kind of, we get a brief whiff of Socrates' anti-democratic way of thinking. He said the question should not be settled by majority vote, but by appealing to the one who knows. For children are one's most precious possessions. I mean, there are persons today arguing that even though we're living in a democratic republic, we can't really allow the people, we can't really allow them to have any real say in how our polity is governed. What we need are experts, technocrats, and academically trained people to run the show for us, or even people, above academically trained people, whoever they would be. All right, so Socrates also states that they have not identified the basic question. Now we're coming to the philosophical question. That is, what is the end for the sake of which we study such an art? And he says, once he says it, you can't disagree with him. He said, the end ultimately is the good of the soul. Because what Socrates is about in all the dialogues is care, the care of the soul. All right, looking after the good of the soul. So in the slides, I distinguished between external goods, goods of the body, and goods of the soul. Plato is single-minded in emphasizing the goods of the soul as categorically superior to the other sorts of good. Okay, so in order to appeal to one who knows the person being evaluated must do one of two things. State who his teacher was, or show the products of his own activity. Okay, so, someone says, I know something. You say, well, why should I trust you? Who was your teacher? Or if he tells you don't know the name of that person, you say, well, just show me your stuff, right? And if it's the proof of the pudding's in the tasting, right? So show me what you know, and if you demonstrate your knowledge, then I'll trust you and I'll sign up for your course, as it were. So Socrates' criteria applied. Socrates then applies his criteria to Nicias and Laches. Can either adduce a teacher who can teach us how to benefit the soul, or can either produce specimens of persons whose souls they themselves have improved. Now, as it happens, right? The answer to this is probably no, but anyway, this turns out to be a mere transition to a philosophical dialogue with each man. The reason for this development is that whether one knows can be determined through the direct method of philosophical interrogation. Okay, so we want to figure out whether Nicias knows anything, whether Laches knows anything. Both of them have spoken, but we need to put these men to the test, and we'll follow the philosophical method. They will put forward definitions or proposed definitions of, once we get to it, courage, and then these will be examined, and if it turns out that the proposed definition leads to a falsehood, right? There's something which is self-contradictory or a statement which obviously stands in contradiction to an obvious truth, then we'll know that there's a problem with the original definition. We'll have to go back to the drawing board. So to anticipate, to improve the soul is to inculcate virtue. There's the Greek term I want you to know. Please do know that term, A-R-E-T-E, there's a long E, arete. To improve the soul is to inculcate virtue in it. And the specific virtue we're talking about is courage. That's the one related to martial activity. So now the question becomes, what is courage? All right. So it was kind of a long path to get to this point. This is the real philosophical question. And, we could have done this a bit more quickly. We could have, Plato could have done it more quickly, right? You'd have had Socrates run into somebody and said, "Oh, Socrates, how are you today? I haven't seen you in a while." Socrates says, "Oh, I'm well, and how about you? What are you up to?" He said, "Well, I'm considering signing my kid up for kung fu lessons." And Socrates says, "Well, why would you want to do that?" He says, "Well, because it'll make him a better fighter." And Socrates says, "Yeah, a better fighter and perhaps more courageous." And the person says, "Well, certainly would make him more courageous." And Socrates might say, "Well, what is courage anyway?" Boom, then you're off into a philosophical discussion. Watch out if you run into a Socrates type character. He might Socratize you and drag you into a philosophical discussion. I made up the verb Socratize, by the way. So, a note on virtue and education. We have to take a step back for a second in order to understand what's going on at this point in the dialogue. So the development up to this point introduces one of the major themes of the Platonic dialogues, and that theme is, can virtue be taught? And the indication that the official position of the dialogues as a whole, and most Plato scholars seem to agree, is the answer is no. All right. But it's not quite, it's not a uniform or perfectly uniform and indisputable position in the dialogues. If you turn to Plato's Republic, it looks like, well, there is a curriculum that we can institute which would cultivate, certain virtues or at least images and shades of virtue in people. We'll get to the Republic. That is virtue a skill like that of playing a stringed instrument or boxing? Can we inculcate courage as a specific skill to be utilized on the appropriate occasion? You guys follow? Just as we use the skill of sewing when we need to make or mend clothing, one could conceivably, making clothing, to make or mend clothing, one could conceivably use courage when one needs to defend oneself or others. But this is the whole question, guys. Is courage a skill? Can it really be used? Or is it rather a sort of habit of the soul, which is exercise? You follow? I mean, if you had the skill of healing people, you could use that to heal people. You would also have enough knowledge of anatomy and chemicals to kill people very efficiently. So, I mean, there have been, doctor killers like Joseph Mengele, people like that, who unfortunately used the medical art for the opposite end for which it was intended. They used it to kill people. They were doing research and stuff like that. I understand that, but still, they killed their subjects in order to examine them. But courage, is that like that? Can you use courage in order to produce a cowardly effect? No, it doesn't make any sense. It seems to be an attribute which generates one effect, not potentially two. The one effect would be a courageous action. Okay. So Socrates' dialogue with Laches. I tell you what, just to continue our tradition of breaking things up into pieces, why don't we go ahead and stop right there. I'll allow this video to upload, and then I'll move on to the rest of it.